started out as a study of the work of D.H. Lawrence. But somewhere along the way, I got caught up in what everybody else says about D.H. Lawrence. And what I ended up telling was the story of the change of the discipline of English studies into something that became cultural studies. And the two particular important names in that story are Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart. And these men came from extremely deprived working class backgrounds, attained scholarships, went to top universities, and wanted to study English literature. But they wanted to study English literature because that was the only place in the higher education environment where they could talk about values, where they could talk about what it was to be British in the mid-20th century. And they found themselves pushing back against the canon, as it was called then, the great traditions of English literature. They found themselves resisting the way in which English literature and English studies was constructed. And both of them wrote very movingly in the early 60s of how they had the honour to work in adult education. One thing that we haven't mentioned today particularly is continuing education. And in the post-war world in Britain, when people came back from the terrible European war, the most important element of our education system, which expanded beyond all measure, was the higher education system, adult education system, sorry, continuing education, the Workers' Education Association. These were incredibly important entities in the 1950s and 1960s. And these figures, who are the origin of my own intellectual growth, were both highly involved, taking their first jobs in adult and continuing education. And in the 1960s, eventually, they broke with English studies. And they broke with English studies because they couldn't talk about the values of their experience and their interests in literature and society. And cultural studies is born in the 1960s. Cultural studies is fascinating because it is transdisciplinary. It is inherently promiscuous in that many of us are familiar with really quite rigid disciplines. So to go back to my question about why me, a lot of your experiences of university are very different to mine in that in cultural studies we never really accept disciplinary boundaries, that we're always transgressing those boundaries and changing those boundaries. So the emergence is what we have of this interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary space. And as one of my tutors said, there is always a problem with conjoining promiscuity to respectability. So within the university, we're always often struggling to gain the respect of hard sciences or engineering because of the very variability of what it is that we do. But it is certainly a history of changing the narrative, and at the heart of it is the relevance, the attempt to study what is most immediately relevant to a group of people who came into the university and didn't say universities don't want to change, but said instead universities are always changing. Because if I were, with great respect, to resist one of the statements that Mohammed Idris made when he said universities are loath to change, in some ways I think perhaps university administrations are loath to change. But every colleague I know talks about changing the university. Every disciplinary colleague, every academic colleague is always talking about pushing and advancing the boundaries of whatever work it is they do, and how often that involves them taking themselves out of where they came from and their original education. So I think, in fact, in the mainstream university, we have to acknowledge that these places are perpetually in change and perpetually in search of relevance. And so when we're talking about leadership, those of us that have any responsibility for schools or for faculties, it's often more about allowing people and acknowledging that they are seeking change and relevance, and kind of giving sustenance and nurture to that. And I think that's an important thing to remember about the mainstream university. Because when I came here, and we're now into Why Nottingham, Malaysia, as well as Why me, I found my own intellectual foundations thoroughly shaken. And they've been shaken very simply, and it's echoed what happened to Hoggart and Williams when they went into continuing discuss, with whom I collaborate, and whom I teach. Teaching here is so utterly different from the UK. UK education here becomes something radically new, and radically I refer you to its etymology. The root of it changes. And the root of it changes in a way, to borrow a concept from the sociologist Gilles Deleuze, in a rhizomatic way. You have all kinds of unusual and organic connections are made with the knowledges of the people in the room. So I've been teaching, for instance, a course on cultural politics, and I come here with my curriculum from the UK. Nobody in the room of my 30 students had ever even been to the UK. For maybe 3/4 of them, English was a second, third, or in 2 cases, 4th language. Conceptually, methodologically, did I say that right? And socially or culturally, relevance had to be achieved within the classroom. And so that course changed, that module changed in the course of 1 year, and each year it changes because of the dynamic of the people in the room. Maybe that's much more available to us in the social sciences than it is in mathematics or in engineering. But in the social sciences, in that sense, and as I'll say in a moment, arts and literature do provide a potential energizing center for the transformation and for change in the university. Which leads me hurriedly, because I'm aware of my time, back to D.H. Lawrence. When I chose surgery for the university novel or a bomb, I was trying to draw a contrast between 2 forms of change. Surgery, as I say in the abstract for this talk, could involve cosmetic surgery. It may just be superficial. It may involve amputation. It may be dramatic. It may involve inoculation. We could explore these metaphors still further. A bomb, is that going to be a smart bomb? Is it going to be a devastating nuclear strike? Is there going to be some collateral damage? Is there going to be friendly fire? Once you explore these metaphors, and what has fascinated me through the day is the different metaphors that people have used, the different stories that people have told. When we are attentive to those metaphors, they start to suggest further ideas about how change might take place. Change is so fundamental to the work of D.H. Lawrence, just as it was to the work of Williams and Hobbes. So I'm going to spend just the final few moments talking about some of the things that D.H. Lawrence can bring to this discussion. When we talked about Macaulay earlier, it also brought to mind a very famous 19th century figure, Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold is in some ways in the same tradition as Macaulay. Macaulay's Minute, which I'm going to forward to everybody later on, also has a wonderful line which says, all of the Sanskrit and Hindu literature is worth less than half a shelf of the European library. So Macaulay was a man with some problems, but also, interestingly, some conviction about libraries, about arts and literature. Obviously, I dismiss entirely his comment about that comparison, but I am interested in why he, of all people, would value the arts and literature so highly. Matthew Arnold, interesting figure, professor of poetry at Cambridge, at Oxford, but also Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools, and also one of the men who designed the civil service examination for the Foreign Office. As the empire expanded, British government didn't know how to administer the enormity of these expanses which had come under their control. So one of the things that the British are very good at doing is setting up bureaucracies. And in order to qualify for the British bureaucracy, you had to pass the civil service exam. Somebody had to design the exam, and that exam had to allow the state to be sure that you understood British values. And those British values were, in no small part, embedded in its literature. Matthew Arnold talked about the touchstones of English literature, Shakespeare, Pope, Milton, these figures, the great literature of Britain. So literature has always, much as the American situation, been embedded, been closely tied up both with national values but also with soft power. What happens when D.H. Lawrence starts writing is that here is a working class writer who has none of the privileges of any other writer that had until that point emerged in the British tradition. His father was a miner, and he managed to achieve some education in the national system, but given his disadvantages, had very little of the privileges that all the previous great writers had had. He was a very scandalous figure. He ran away with the wife of a Nottingham University professor, and was indeed, although Nottingham now has the largest archive of Lawrence material in the world, and a beautiful archive, for 30 years you weren't allowed to mention the name of D.H. Lawrence in the University of Nottingham, because this poor professor was still sat in the corner worrying about what happened to his wife. But that elopement actually changed Lawrence's life completely. Already an outsider, he became an exile. And I do strongly encourage you to look into Lawrence, because he then spent the remaining 25 years of his short life, 15 years of his short life, going all over the world, engaging with as many different cultures and different knowledge economies and different knowledge practices and different art forms. And as you trace his writing, you see this dialogue with the other. We've been talking about the other and how we engage with alterity and the otherness. Lawrence was this person who was completely open to different cultures. So he was in Tahiti, he was in Ceylon, he was in New Mexico, he was down in Oaxaca in Mexico, all the time searching for ways of opening himself to other cultures. So part of this narrative about the value of literature and culture is that we don't have to accept the national narrative, we don't have to accept the power narrative. What we can also look into is the way that literature and the arts and creative experience are part of change and are part of relevance. And as I looked at this surgery for the novel Au Revoir and thought about relations to the university, I kind of tried to think about whether or not there was a parallel that I might explore. And so the paper that I'm writing explores the way in which universities have changed in a very similar way to the way the novel form changed. In the 19th century, the novel was this great realist, the big book of life, as Lawrence called it, which would attempt to understand what Brené Williams calls knowable community. So the great 19th century writers, Tolstoy, George Eliot, they tried to write these novels that would comprehend the experience of whole societies. A tremendous ambition. Always a flawed ambition, but a tremendous ambition. Gradually, as we moved into the 20th century, metaphysics and philosophy changed, the novel becomes much more interior, much more specialized. The modern novel, in some ways, becomes abstract and obscure, and this is what D.H. Lawrence's essay actually talks about. So if you think about James Joyce's Ulysses, it's a monologue within the mind of a single individual. The avant-garde becomes more and more removed from the everyday reader, the general reader. Does that story sound anything like the story of the development of the university? Increasing specialization, increasing distance from the ordinary student, the ordinary person. What's interesting about the novel is that the resurgence of the novel and the resurgence of creative forms that are similar to the novel is all about this decolonizing process. That world Englishes, which is a response perhaps to the soft power of American English, world Englishes are now the dominant feature of literary studies within the academy. And in that small example, and in the ways that writing back, The Empire Writes Back is the name of a famous collection of critical essays about post-colonial literature, writing back has decolonized literary form and has introduced, for instance, magical realism, to take one example, the South American and Latin American examples of writing that have completely changed the way in which consciousness is explored within a Western literary tradition. So what I'm wondering is, as we move towards the end of this first day, and as we start to think, well, what are we going to take forward into the next 2 days and to our statement that we must make? First, I think we must take from today the importance of an attention to history and for looking at where these traditions have emerged from, but also being sensitive to the contradictions within our history. As everybody said, decolonizing is not simply about assuming that everything was simple and homogenized and all bad. But at the same time, as we look forward to the coming days, I think I'm interested in the way transgression takes place, the way what Raymond Williams called the emergent structure of feeling can be appreciated, often in very curious ways. So there is, if you'll forgive me, an emergent structure of feeling in the way that Professor Raju is contesting the dynamics of mathematics and metaphysics. That work at the some people would say the cutting edge, but that work that writes back against the dominant and the hegemonic systems is where change takes place and relevance is apparent. And we can't always spot it, but at least these 3 days are going to give us the opportunity to see some of those shoots of life, and hopefully to mean that we need neither surgery nor a bomb, but we'll just be able to take over the university altogether. That's a rather banal way to finish, but let's change the rules, let's change the narrative, but let's change the disciplines. Am I on time?